Allora, ci siamo, bentrovati, benvenuti a tutti. Siamo arrivati all'ultimo dei nostri 4 appuntamenti, racconti sull'arte americana, Tales of American Art. Oggi l'incontro sarà in lingua inglese perché abbiamo il piacere di avere qui con noi ospite dagli Stati Uniti, dalla University of Pennsylvania, Huey Copeland, che è un professore che ha fatto delle ricerche molto importanti sull'arte afroamericana o su artisti che raccontano e che hanno investigato maggiormente quelle comunità e quelle storie. Io vi ricordo che questo appuntamento è un appuntamento sempre costruito grazie alla collaborazione con l'Università degli Studi di Firenze. Infatti c'è qui con noi il professor Giorgio Bacci, che farà poi una brevissima introduzione, che ringrazio ovviamente per il supporto e la collaborazione di tutto il Dipartimento allo svolgimento di questi appuntamenti. Poi adesso faremo uno switch velocemente in lingua inglese per introdurre il nostro ospite. Vi ricordo che l'incontro avrà una durata di circa 50 minuti, al termine del quale potete partecipare utilizzando il tasto alza la mano che vi permetterà poi di fare una domanda, un intervento al professor Copeland. Quindi, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Copeland for being here. It was very nice in meeting you and having a discussion about the exhibition and going more in depth. And he's going to give us an overview about some of the artists participating in our show. And so thanks again for being here. You're in Chicago right now, if I'm not wrong.
Michigan.
I'm Michigan. And so, Giorgio, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, with great pleasure. Thank you, Martino, and warm welcome to Professor Copeland for being here. Thank you very much, and it's an honor really to introduce you in this our last conference. So, Professor Copeland is currently BFC Presidential Associate Professor at the Department of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania and Mellon Professor at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And prior to arriving at Penn, he taught at Northwestern University for 15 years. His work has received support from the American Council of Learned Societies, l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the George O'Keeffe Museum Research Center for American Modernism, and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. Huey Copeland's interdisciplinary work explores African diasporic, American, and European art from the late 18th century to the present, with an emphasis on articulations of Blackness in the Western visual field. In particular, his research hones in on the vexed intersections of race and gender, subject and object. The aesthetic and its other from a Black feminist perspective that aims to put pressure on the blind spots and conventions of modernist art history. An editor of October and a contributing editor of Art Forum, Copeland has published in numerous periodicals, as well as in international exhibition catalogs and essay collections, such as the groundbreaking anthology Historias Afroatlánticas, produced by the Museo de Arte de Sao Paulo. Among his publications, I would like to remember at least Bound to Appear, Art, Slavery, and the Site of Blackness in Multicultural America, a book funded by a Creative Capital World Foundation Arts Writers Program grant, and published in 2013 by the University of Chicago Press. And Professor Copeland is now at work on 2 volumes that further interrogate the imbrication of the racial and the aesthetic. Black Modernism, an anthology credited with Stephen Nelson and commissioned by the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and In the Shadow of the Negress, a brief history of modern artistic practice in the transatlantic world, a monograph exploring the constitutive role played by fictions of Black womanhood in Western art. So once more, welcome, Professor Copeland, and thank you for being here, even if just virtual, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Giorgio, for that lovely introduction, and to Martino for the invitation. And of course, to all of you for coming out this evening. Buonasera. That is pretty much the limit of my Italian, but I'll make sure to do my best to speak at a regular pace and to enunciate clearly so y'all can follow along. It is a pleasure to be able to speak with you on the occasion of such a timely exhibition drawn from the Walker Art Center's collection that presents a wide range of American artistic production from the 1960s to the present. Tonight, I want to explore with you the particular historical significance and critical force of African American art, as emblematized by the work of Kerry James Marshall, Lorna Simpson, and Glenn Ligon, three practitioners featured in the show, all of whom emerged in the 1980s, came to prominence in the multicultural New York art world of the 1990s, and have since become central to any understanding of the means and methods of contemporary global artistic practice, as they have gone on to show in Venice and Münster. In 1989, the New York Times critic Michael Brenson proclaimed that Black artists had finally garnered their place in the sun, after decades, even centuries, of critical neglect. His forecast accurately predicted one representational drift of the long decade from 1989 to 2001, when Black artists and curators enjoyed unprecedented access to and visibility within mainstream United States exhibition venues and discourses. Consider the benchmarks that have come to define the critical fates and fortunes of Black artists in New York during the period. In 1990, three alternative institutions, the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Studio Museum in Harlem, launched The Decade Show, Frameworks of Identity in the 1980s, an exhibition that both aimed to right the wrongs of the past 10 years and to set the standard of inclusion for omnibus exhibitions in the decade to come. Few institutions embrace this agenda more fiercely than the Whitney Museum of American Art, as evidenced by changes in the racial composition of the artists featured in the museum's influential biennials. In contrast to the 1989 exhibition, which featured a sole Black participant, abstract sculptor Martin Prieur, the 1991 iteration included contributions by Ligon, Simpson, Nayland Blake, and Carrie Mae Weems, all artists associated with the semiotic or post-structuralist approach to the Black image. Yet even this gathering would pale in comparison to the hotly debated 1993 Whitney Biennial, which featured more than a dozen artists of African descent, nearly 16% of the total practitioners tapped for the exhibition, who worked in an even more expansive array of modes, from the figurative sculptures of Alison Sarr to the site-sensitive installations of Renee Green. One of the biennial's co-curators, Thelma Golden, would go on to mount Black Male, representations of masculinity in American art at the Whitney in 1994. The same year that Time magazine triumphantly announced the emergence of a Black Renaissance across the cultural field. From one vantage, Time's coverage represented a high-water mark in the general public's consciousness of African-American visual practice, one that was only matched sporadically during the rest of the decade. To be sure, Black artists of various aesthetic stripes were featured in subsequent Whitney biennials. Ellen Gallagher in 1995, MacArthur Genius Fellows Marshall and Kara Walker in 1997, and Dawood Bey, Thornton Dial, and Arthur Jaffa in 2000, to name only those figures who come foremost to mind. However, it would not be until Golden's 2001 exhibition Freestyle at the Studio Museum in Harlem, which notoriously introduced the notion of post-Blackness, that a New York exhibition highlighting artists of color would again seize the mainstream imagination. A few things can be gleaned from this admittedly partial and partisan narrative that are of both sociological and art historical import. Many of the artists who garnered attention at the outset of the 90s were championed because their work rhymed with and seemed to extend the concerns of artists whose post-structuralist approaches to the image had placed them at the forefront of critical practice. Of course, Black practitioners in the 1990s could also look back to the examples provided by pioneering African-American artists who had emerged in the 1970s. On the one hand, to the Black conceptualism of Adrian Piper, David Hammonds, and Charles Gaines, and on the other, to the irreverent formalism of Robert Colescott, Barclay Hendricks, and Howardina Pindell, whose work in painting and sculpture worked with and against the racist biases of the most traditional of aesthetic media. Taken together, these tendencies opened up an expanded field of Blackness that would enable subsequent practitioners to fully exploit the dialectical constitution of the racial sign. In exploring with you the critical deformative work of Marshall, Simpson, and Ligon on the racial sign, my approach is informed by the Black radical tradition, which the late cultural theorist Cedric Robinson defined as, quote, an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle, unquote. For Robinson, author of the magisterial 1983 tome, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, Black studies is no less than the critique of Western civilization. It is in that spirit that I want to chart the Black practices of Marshall, Simpson, and Ligon and their implications for our reimagining not only of the art historical canon, but also of its signal styles, modes, and forms. As any number of African-American artistic critics like Michelle Wallace have noted, Western canons, until relatively recently, have time and again travestied or sidelined Black artists.
Professor, sorry to bother. We can't actually see anything.
Yeah, that you should.
It's okay. Okay. Sorry.
It's all right. This is a moment where I'm just asking you to listen and just focus on the argument. So Western canons have time and again travestied or sidelined Black artists. Such historical overlooking is, I think, not coincidental. To recognize the work and vision of Black folks would mean reckoning with the fundamental relationship of the visual and the social. It would mean acknowledging art history's role in the maintenance of white patriarchy and facing the fact that so often Black artists, however lauded, are seen not as individual makers of complex forms, but as interchangeable signifiers of racial identity or institutional progress. Ironically, thanks to the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, which has everywhere marked the modern world, Black peoples have for centuries been produced as models of the object, the commodity, and even the work of art, and are thus uniquely positioned to question and deform those very categories. Given the history and the intelligence required to survive the conditions of enslavement, Jim Crow segregation, and mass incarceration, Black cultural practitioners have developed aesthetic means in life and in work that in many ways outstrip the narrow aesthetic confines of the Western canon, because these are artists who yearn not simply for acceptance by white society, but for the liberation of Black peoples. That would entail a radical rethinking of what counts as the aesthetic and an embrace of what theorist Frank Wilderson has called, quote, representational monstrosity, unquote. Cast in this light, the canon functions less as a fixed rubric and more as a vital site of articulation and contestation for Black artists. So the canon counts, but how and why? To begin answering these questions, it is helpful to recall the multiplicity of the term itself, courtesy of the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines the canon as, quote, the list of works considered to be permanently established as being of the highest quality, unquote. Such lists and notions of quality, like the canon itself, are mutable and dependent on cultural context, geographical location, and political moment. Canons shift, expand, and occasionally contract over times in ways that are often small and incremental, but nonetheless measurable. Just consider, for instance, how Art Since 1900, the reigning US textbook in the most heavily trafficked period of art historical discourse today, the late 20th and early 21st centuries, has expanded since its first edition. The third edition, seen here, includes many more artistic practices from the Global South, such as South African photography, and foregrounds others, such as the Brazilian neo-concretist avant-garde, even going so far as to put a work by Lygia Clarke on the cover. Despite such adjustments, these texts, like much of culture in the West, remains foundationally anti-Black. All three editions of Art Since 1900, for instance, give relatively short shrift to Black artists, reflecting the author's commitment to a narrowly defined understanding of criticality and an art historical narrative that, in prizing formal innovation above all else, can only see African-American artists as historically belated. Yet, as we know, what counts as a radical aesthetic intervention is always shifting and contextually dependent, since earlier tactics can be refashioned with a different valence, which is, in a sense, the lesson that Blackness itself offers, and that Kerry James Marshall's painting has so trenchantly modeled since he completed his artistic training in Los Angeles in 1978 under the tutelage of legendary African-American draftsman Charles White. In Marshall's sumptuous De Style of 1993, the artist depicts a traditional Black barbershop in his now trademark style, in which darkly pigmented figures engage each other in a fantasized cultural landscape. Of course, by titling the work De Style, Marshall not only evokes African-American linguistic vernacular, but also aims, I think, to recall and refigure our memory of De Stijl, the early 20th century avant-garde movement most associated with an artist like Piet Mondrian. Such moves, De Stijl to De Style, are typical of Marshall's critical operations and his satirical address to Western art history's past and his own claims on the canon. In this regard, another definition of the term, the very first to appear in the OED, can take us a bit further. There, a canon is defined as, quote, a general law, rule, principle, or criterion by which something is judged, unquote. As seen throughout his art, Marshall knows these criteria well, and he has positioned himself art historically within those master lineages so as to better contest them. It's important, however, that for Marshall, it's not about masterpieces or being a master, since he in fact disidentifies from the master's position and the despotism that it often entails. Indeed, in order to mark this distinction, when he smells mastery, he does so without an E, in order to index the ways in which mastery is performed and pronounced in African American vernacular, and to make and mark his own Black critical understanding of what artistic mastery might be. Mastery, in Marshall's terms, is not about static facts or states of being, but about process, performance, and practice, the hard work of making one painting after another. His Black radical figurative practice has licensed and made visible a whole range of painters from across the diaspora, especially women artists such as Micheline Thomas and Tiyen Odutola, on both of whose practices Marshall has brilliantly written. But just as Marshall's work helps us better understand the logic of contemporary practice, it also helps us to revisit the past through his uncanny and recursive plays on previous articulations of form and color, such as the nearly impossible to see monochromatic canvases of Ad Reinhardt, which served as a touchstone for Marshall's rendering of Black skin tones. Marshall's work might be understood then as what African-American literary critic Houston Baker called a deformation of mastery, and one that advertises itself as such. To quote Baker, the deformation of mastery distinguishes rather than conceals. It secures territorial advantage and heightens the group's survival possibilities. The implications for viewing Marshall in this light are both artistic and art historical. The British art historian T.J. Clark, for instance, famously argued that modernist painting at its best and most extreme is about its practices of negation, emblematized for him by Reinhardt's various refusals of pictorial convention that aim to travesty the very understanding of the visual elements that had been before presumed to be requirements for art making of any serious. Marshall's practice, however, is one that not only reshapes the assumptions of Western art, its subjects, thematics, and intended audiences, but also its signature procedures. For his work operates as what might be called a practice of affirmation rather than of negation that says yes and no to Western painting's means and conventions so that might be repurposed in the service of Black subjects. By, in Marshall's words, rendering Blackness chromatic rather than simply a sign of darkness or negation, his art reframes and undoes an entire Western visual regime, whether as seen in the blackface minstrelsy of racist kitsch or in the avant-garde gambits of an artist like Picasso in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Both kinds of practices, whether racist kitsch or avant-garde art, are often predicated on the instrumentalization and emptying out of visual signifiers of Black being. Marshall's paintings, by contrast, give Black folks to themselves not as signs for someone else's pleasure, but as opaque, complex subjects, at the same time that he does not lose sight of the ways that the white world produces those Black folks as ghosts who are often invisible, literally and socially dead. In this way, Marshall's painting pinpoints the Black subject's position in the white world, only to open onto the immense life and beauty that thrives beyond the veil of race. Such a critical operation underlines the multiplicity of Marshall's works. Indeed, given the numerous additive layers that constitute his practice in its interventions, we need then yet another definition of the canon. Quote, a piece in which the same melody is begun in different parts successively so that the imitations overlap, unquote. This understanding of the canon is necessary to see the work of Black artists in a global frame, to reckon with their conceits and strategies for recasting the visual that Marshall's mastery so abundantly gives us to see in all of its forming and deforming power, whether in painting, his favorite medium, or on occasion with the written word. Here, I show you one of his printed posters, which revisit the linguistic modes inaugurated in the 60s conceptualism of an artist like Lawrence Weiner, only to reframe the address of that language by incorporating not a neutral description of a physical place, but in this case, by any means necessary, the fiery revolutionary rhetoric of Malcolm X. Such a reordering of tactics, categories, and mastery itself are equally part of Lorna Simpson's photo-based conceptual practice. Since the mid-1980s, her art has preoccupied itself with the image of the Black female body, ever marked by the history of the Middle Passage. But in her mind, that figure is truly a figure, a site meant to refract and reframe the shared conditions of language and representation that differently inform different subjects' perception of what it means to be human in the modern era. For Simpson, bringing those conditions into view meant coming to grips with and altering the legacies of conceptual art. The strategy she deploys in her most famous work, such as Guarded Conditions of 1989, look back to the part-by-part serial construction of phototextual practices that emerged in the early 1970s. Simpson was familiar with the art of Martha Rosler and Alan Sekula, and like the African-American artist Carrie Mae Weems, she studied with noted feminist conceptual artist Eleanor Antin at the University of California, San Diego in the early 80s. There, Simpson eventually abandoned her earlier documentary photography for a more critically inflected idiom. As did her teacher Antin, Simpson seized upon conceptualism's signature tropes, the grid, seriality, repetition, and language, in order to examine how our knowledge of the world comes to be visually produced and organized. The proliferation of these informational forms in visual art since the 1960s were part and parcel of a larger structuralist turn whose effects continue to resonate throughout the humanities. By approaching all cultural phenomena as predicated upon the same ironclad rules that govern the linguistic play of differences, artists, historians, anthropologists, and psychoanalysts aim to underline the lapses and failures of seemingly total epistemic systems, and to reveal the divergent constitution of subjects within those Simpsons. In Simpson's hands, deploying structuralist means meant altering the grounds of the figure's articulation in order to account for the specific circumstances through which the Black female subject comes into visibility. On this score, it is worth comparing Guarded Conditions to Antin's Carving, a traditional sculpture of 1972. In the course of a 36-day period, Antin lost 10 pounds through dieting and recorded her gradual transformation in a series of gridded photographs, 4 for each day, providing 4 views of her body. The resulting feminist work parodies even as it capitulates to notions of idealized female form. The artist has an exhibitionist streak that might easily be called narcissistic, and the self-reduction or carving she undertakes through weight loss still maintains her bodily integrity and arguably augments its appeal. No such assertion can be made about Simpson's work, which relies on repetition to make clear the difference that racialization makes. To understand what that difference is, we might turn to Easy for Who to Say of 1989. In this photo text, the artist has covered each iteration of the model's face with one of the vowels, A, E, I, O, U. The second edition of Webster's International Dictionary defines a vowel as, quote, a speech sound uttered with voice or whisper and characterized by the resonance form of the vocal cavities, unquote. In other words, the enunciation of a vowel requires a relaxation of the mouth and jaw, an opening of the body that is countered, blocked in Simpson's work by those representative letters. Though these letters concealing the model's face might intimate a number of subject positions she could occupy: adulterer, engineer, optimist. Such musings are cut short by the matching red words marching beneath the pictures: amnesia, error, indifference, omission, uncivil. These words would undermine not only the position this Black woman would seek, but also Black women's grasp on any recognizable social position at all. In this photo text, the meaning of the letter, like the orientation of the subject, is understood as unstable, yet always susceptible to reifying impositions, those notions of amnesia, omission, indifference, and incivility. Easy for Who to Say thus stages the difficulty of representing the Black female body, while also maintaining the sense of absence that is constitutive of identity, however defined. Viewed from this perspective, the words below Simpson's photographs suggest not only the ways in which Black women have historically been denied access to the universal, to the human, to positions of mastery, but also how they have been produced as the negative grounds, as slaves, flesh, chattel, against which the modern, the subject, the master constructs himself. Still, Simpson's effacement of the figure underscores that the identity of this Black woman, however prescribed, can never entirely be accounted for, given the structural incompletion she shares with all subjects. What we witness in this work, as in Guarded Conditions, is a method whereby the peculiarities of one Black woman's body at once guide and follow the pattern upon which the work is modeled. The fall of her braids and the tilt of her head determine the shape of a vowel. The delicate wing of her collarbones draws us toward the neck. Visually marked by the historical regimes that would cast them as objects, in Simpson's art, African diasporic women are rendered as subjects, necessarily caught within those schemas of race and sex that would curtail their subjective potentialities as well as the artists. Each of these figures disjunctively resets the scale and our notion of the human, her contours disrupted and her subjectivity translated in order to speak of histories that are and are not her own. In this way, the figural fragmentation operative in Simpson's work expands beyond the frame, gesturing backward to the violence performed upon the Black female body historically and projected outward into the spectatorial field. For even as a piece like Guarded Conditions laterally expands to include an army of identically clad subjects, it also aims to pull us as viewers into its orbit, to implicate us in its categories, to establish the Black female body as a site of identification and displacement. To encounter these images of the body, subject to sex attacks and skin attacks, as the word spelled out on the bottom underline, is to encounter an image of the body on a scale slightly greater. It is to encounter a projected vision of ourselves on the block, as if our body shadows have been thrown onto the wall and into the past by some unseen cone of light. Through such analogical solicitation, the work proposes that we test our form against it. Similarly, the model's placement before a white studio backdrop foregrounds our framing within the white cube of artistic consumption. Both aspects of the piece refer us to the Black female body, a corporeal site everywhere riven by imperatives other than its own, yet reminding us of our own positions within a world run by biopower, which Michel Foucault defines as, quote, the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life, unquote. In the artist's photographs, the dynamics of subjection which pertain to us all become most visible at the site of the Black female body, regardless of whether that figure literally appears or not. Simpson's multi-part wigs of 1994, also on view at the Palazzo, offers a case in point. This work is composed of serigraphs printed on felt depicting hair pieces purchased in Brooklyn, alongside narrative fragments that range from a psychoanalyst's interview with the mother of an avowed fetishist to lines lifted from William and Ellen Craft's 1848 slave narrative, in which they describe how they disguise themselves in order to escape from bondage. Ellen dressing up as an infirm old white male, and her husband William dressing up as the slave who was escorting her. Simpson's wigs thus suggest that the look of Black femininity might be altered to save the sensing self through a combination of visual ruse and tactile identity that are hinted at by the very rich textures on which these images are printed. In this work, it is as if the conditions affecting Black women can only come into view when the body and the presumptions that accompany it are absented from the field of vision. Simpson's work thus entails not only a deformation of the conceptual strategies she learned at the feet of her mistress, but also a détournement of the visual itself. Such a critical attitude toward the visual are key to what literary critic Hortense Spillers has called the African-American critical posture, which in canceling vision aims to reframe our seeing. This ambition is evidenced throughout the multimedia work of Black gay artist Glenn Ligon, who often turns text into image and back again in a way that Jasper Johns could only dream of. Ligon became known in the early 1990s for paintings like this one, inscribed with a line from a 1928 essay by the African-American folklorist Zora Neale Hurston. These works not only transmute word into image, but affective mantra into projective blur, figure into ground, white into Black. This visual effect is the result of Ligon's procedure, as he drags his stencil along the surface of the canvas to produce the statement one line after the next. I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. I feel most colored when I am thrown against a sharp white background. I feel most colored. By the end of the canvas, Ligon has left us in the dark, grasping to make out phrases that are a foregone conclusion. In these works, the artist relies upon language in its corporeal and metaphorical dimensions to cast Blackness less as a fact of perception than as a frame of mind dependent upon the presence of whiteness for its meaning. The one is literally illegible without the other. Or, as the theorist Frantz Fanon stated in his indispensable Black Skin, White Masks, published in French in 1952, the Negro is not any more than the white man. Both, in other words, are caught up in a bind that disallows mutual recognition. In performing this impossibility and its perpetual recurrence within representation, Ligon's painting stages the murkiness of racial thinking and runs headlong into the dilemma thrown up by Fanon's negative ontology of race. If Black being cannot be accessed rationally, then it is its effective contours that must be intimated in the gaps that structure conventional modes of speech. Indeed, while Ligon's text paintings can be read as both printed page and flattened image, when viewed obliquely, the letters seem to float above and recede into their grounds, becoming three-dimensional apparitions that illuminate the deceptions of the gaze and gesture toward other arenas of perception. It is the contingency, plenitude, and symbolism of Black feeling, in other words, that for Ligon open onto those fugitive states that the Black image and its liability for stereotypical reduction would seem to foreclose. However, it is James Baldwin's Stranger in the Village essay of 1953, a wide-ranging reflection prompted by the Black American sojourn in a snowbound Swiss alpine hamlet with his lover, that in fact most vividly describes how it feels to be colored against a white ground. Quote, "From all evidence, no Black man had ever set foot in this tiny Swiss village before I came," unquote. So reads the first sentence of Baldwin's Stranger in the Village essay. Ligon would proceed to inscribe the entirety of that essay's first 5 paragraphs onto canvas in an orderly horizontal spread, and the result was stunningly dark. At first glance, the work seems to fit squarely within the tradition of the monochrome, but does so to redirect it. In this sense, Ligon's work can be understood in Baker's term as a mastery of form that, quote, conceals, disguises, floats like a trickster butterfly in order to sting like a bee. Indeed, we might well compare Ligon's Black painting to another, the incredibly influential Black square executed by Kazimierz Malevich in 1915, and recently discovered in 2015 to have under its apparently blank Black surface, in fact, a racist joke inscribed in it, a takeoff on another racist joke through the monochrome made by the French cartoonist and satirist Alphonse Allais in 1884, when he printed this image you see below, Combat des nègres dans une cave pendant la nuit, or Negroes battling in a cave at night. So a snippet of that phrase has, through X-ray technology, been discovered underneath Malevich's canvas, so that seeing Malevich's work now in relation to Ligon's helps us to further understand Ligon's prescience and his mastery of form. For rather than making a Black square that covers over racialized language, he gives us a Black square made of racialized language. To stand before Ligon's untitled 2002 is to encounter a work 10 feet wide and 6 feet high, neither truly abstract nor altogether representational, that is somehow inscrutable, yet all the more seductive. Its surface, covered with coal dust, has an uneven, crumbling texture, and the overall effect is of a mottled veil that in some patches becomes opaque and in others reveals fragments of Baldwin's text. The painterly technique employed throughout the Stranger in the Village series, begun around 1997 and now numbering more than 20 pieces that vary in size, shape, darkness, and cited passage, obviously revisits Ligon's signature strategy of stenciled inscription. Indeed, this 2002 work seems to begin almost where I Feel Most Colored left off. Again, suspended in the gap between legibility and illegibility to achieve a sensuous image, and now making the language that accumulated at the foot of the earlier work a total compositional field. But unlike its colored cousin, the Stranger in the Village painting is replete in its strangeness. It does not propose an affinity between our bodies and itself. It does not speak in an I and an uncanny voicing. And it resists a certain flirtation with self-portraiture, unlike I Feel Most Colored against a sharp background. Given the similar flows of Baldwin's and Ligon's lives, from children of the ghetto to global citizens, his subjective alignment with Baldwin is perhaps the most resonantly felt. But these untitled Black paintings, I want to say, do not so much merely ventriloquize Baldwin's text as they effectively materialize his peculiar status in painterly terms. I remember an interview, Ligon tells us, where, quote, Baldwin is asked if he didn't at some point think his life was hopeless, being poor, Black, and gay. And Baldwin says, no, I thought I hit the jackpot. For Ligon, it is Baldwin's contention that the place of the marginal, of the disesteemed, of the left behind is a productive place to speak from and to make as the engine of his own practice. The double negation of Blackness and gayness now rendered through the double negation of Black text on Black words. So just as Baldwin's presumed lack affords an embarrassment of riches, a jackpot, so in Ligon's Stranger paintings, coal dust sprinkled onto wet stenciled paint and then sealed with glue generates a storm of glimmering visual incidents. Like coal dust, Blackness is a kind of excess, the byproduct of a racializing apparatus aiming to naturalize white superiority and justify the transformation of African subjects into American objects. Yet as Baldwin reminds us near the close of his essay, the dereliction of Blackness also limbs the transatlantic origins of the African-American subject and uniquely positions him at the nexus of the modern world. Quote, the history of the American Negro problem is not merely shameful. It is also something of an achievement. For even when the worst has been said, it must also be added that the perpetual challenge posed by this problem was always somehow perpetually met. It is precisely this Black-white experience which may prove of indispensable value to us in the world we face today, unquote. Baldwin's self-imposed exile in Switzerland, amidst folk who regarded him as a dark abstraction suddenly made flesh, allowed him to perceive that the particular tortures and deep intimacies of the Black-white relation in the United States, from slavery to the present, have at least made necessary the attempt to differently imagine what the human might be and whom it might encompass. As Ligon attested in the early 2000s, quote, almost 50 years after its publication, Stranger in the Village continues to open up a space in which to comprehend debates in Europe around immigration and xenophobia and the failure of the dream in post-civil rights America, unquote. That space, I think, also continues to mark a structuring limit, which is not to say constraint, of Baldwin's position, as well as the artist's own. In drawing our attention to Baldwin's words and demanding that we attempt to reread them, Ligon does not only refigure the sense of dispossession that marks the Black subject beneath the white gaze. He also reflects on that sense of being continually unmoored, which Harold Crews described nearly 40 years ago as the lot of the Negro intelligentsia, quote, that rootless class of displaced persons who are refugees from the social poverty of the Black world, unquote. It is this sense of placelessness that Ligon's work bodies forth, underlining the continuity of and possibility for affiliation created by the dispersal of African subjects the world over. Yet the very success of Ligon and other well-placed yet placeless practitioners continues to rely upon tastemakers such as Thelma Golden, who are positioned within powerful mainstream institutions and who can therefore create momentary openings for alternative voices that make freshly visible African-American art's capacious range of critical procedures and positions. Such opportunities, however, are all too contingent and always under threat of reverting to business as usual. Important facts for us to remember today amidst the vogue for all things Black. This all too familiar narrative was foretold before the 1990s even properly began. In her essay for the Decade Show catalog, curator Eunice Limpton succinctly diagnosed the modes of forgetting that continue to structure marginalized histories. Quote, endlessly we, women, Asians, Latins, gays, Blacks, Native Americans, searched the public record for our histories and for the wholeness we felt. Wasn't it just a minute ago? That wholeness that comes from satisfying work, good friends, a fortifying home. Or to put it another way, from seeing and being seen, speaking to and being responded to, feeling hungry and being fed. Just as the satisfaction accompanying that visibility begins to warm us, it vanishes. The timing of denial is always exquisite, unquote. We needn't look far to find confirmation not only of the erasure of Black artists from official narratives, but also of the continuing ghettoization of the aesthetic, discursive, and political implications of their work. For while the explosion of African-American artistic practices since the 1990s can no longer be ignored, they are still too often couched as aberrations from the defining artistic achievements of the last 200 years, despite the fact that Black practitioners' work over this longue durée demands a recasting of what constitutes the aesthetic. Indeed, I would argue that the entire history of modern and contemporary art can be retold as a story of engagement with and retreat from the vicissitudes of race and gender as manifested in the visual field, from Marie-Guillemine Benoit's Portrait d'une Négresse of 1800 up through Kara Walker's psychosexually charged silhouettes. There have been numerous terms to describe this critical failure. Golden has called it exclusion by self-imposed amnesia. Walson Wallace has gone so far as to deem the visual itself a negative scene of instruction within Black culture. And artist Howardina Pindell, ever forthright, continues to document evidence of art world racism in meticulous detail. Placed alongside Lipton's account, each of these descriptions suggests the economies of denial and forgetting that are part and parcel of artistic discourse's fantasy of itself as a liberal space of gamesmanship. I would contend, however, that the structural underpinnings of the art world and its institutions must be seen as integral to the modern era's varied techniques for, quote, the social reproduction of white supremacy, unquote. This framework allows us to understand, on the one hand, how despite substantive gains over the last 5 decades, Black incomes in the 1990s remained well below those of any other ethnic group in the United States. Black populations continue to be produced as abject classes, both visually and materially, phenomena that find constant spectacular confirmation, whether through the 1991 videotape of unarmed Black motorist Rodney King being beaten at the hands of white Los Angeles police officers, or the digitally recorded murder of George Floyd last summer that set off protests around the world. These episodes and accounts asked us to consider both the spectacular and the insidious day-to-day biases that Black subjects within the racialized social system of the art world and beyond must negotiate and make visible. It is with these imperatives in mind that we might revisit the recent art of the United States so that the task of reimagining its future can properly begin. Grazie.
Thank you so much. It was very intense, very detailed, and so I think we are literally overwhelmed by content and quotes and references that we would love to delve into more, maybe in the future.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to explain or sit with anything that would be helpful.
And I think, thank you so much for especially the very last part of this lecture, because we were reconnecting the artworks that we are presenting in our show, or some of them, to the historical moment. And that's why in our show, we decided, the curators actually, they decided to present several artists in order to broaden a vision about the American society, and not just making an exhibition only focus on certain aspects. So it could have been reductive, and that was the opposite approach in designing this exhibition. And Carol Walker, she's at the very end of our exhibition. It's the final punch in the stomach, because it's not giving an happy ending of the exhibition, of course.
Yes, and I think that's so helpful, because it does two things. One, it really allows viewers to see the incredible range of African-American artistic production in terms of media, from photography to painting, from conceptually based work. And at the same time, it shows us the ways in which African-American artists have wrestled with the histories and the present of racial violence and racial despotism. But I think it's important not to reduce the artist's work to simply an illustration of its contemporary moment. Rather, I would claim that for artists like Walker, for artists like Ligon, for artists like Marshall and Simpson to engage with Blackness as a sign, as a site, as a concept, is to very much engage in and continue the tradition of modernism, right? They're very much looking back to at Reinhardt. They're thinking about Malevich. They're thinking about, Joseph Kosuth and his famous conceptual piece, Black and White, where it's just photostat dictionary definitions of those two words posed against each other to underline the kind of disparity between how they're used and conceptualized circa 1966 in the United States. So I think part of the reason that we can see and appreciate these perspectives more and this work more is because art history is coming to grips with the ways in which its history is deeply racialized, right? And part and parcel of a conversation about rhetorics of race. And that's true whether we're thinking about Malevich or looking at, say, sculpture from the 1920s by Brancusi, Blonde Négresse, right? So what does it mean to be, recruiting the sort of figure of Black femininity in that moment? And at the same time, in, say, 1976, when a feminist artist like Cindy Sherman, who becomes most famous for her untitled film stills, when she really first starts working, she is making photographs where her entire body is covered in cork, right? She's making her body blackface, right? So even someone like Cindy Sherman, their early work is also engaged with the question of how race appears in the visual field. So that this question of the meaning and the representation of race is not ancillary or coincidental. It's in fact central to the history of modern and contemporary Euro-American art. And I think these artists seize upon that, they engage those histories. At the same time, they're trying to open new ways of understanding Blackness without simply reproducing certain kinds of negative stereotypes that make Blackness a sort of space of foreclosure. So for all of these artists, they're suggesting that I think Blackness is a place of radical expansiveness that touches any number of kind of social conditions or practices, whether or not it's sort of brought to the fore.
Thank you so much. Very clear, and it's very complex as well. I think it's a very delicate balance between how they want to represent themselves without being constricted into a certain kind of structure or legacy. Even though you were mentioning, I haven't thought about Jasper Johns connected to Glenn Ligon, but there's a strong visual connection, and there's this strong legacy and heritage from the modernism into those languages coming out from the 90s.
Yeah. Of course, and when Ligon first sort of appeared on the scene in the early 1990s, there were lots of comparison of his work to Jasper Johns, thinking about Johns's numbers and his alphabets because he's using the same kind of stencils. But whereas for Johns, it simply is about running through the system, numbers 1 through 9, alphabet A through Z, and then sort of stenciling them repetitively across the canvas to again be a compositional device. Ligon says, yes, I'm interested in that technique, but I want to actually use full words and sentences, right? So it's not simply about the kind of alphabet as a symptom, as a system. It's about being able to mobilize it as a site of articulation, right? And so I think that kind of formal tie to Johns is really what made Ligon's work understandable and legible to its earliest audiences and laudable. So these are all artists, I think, who understand that for the critiques they want to lodge to land, their work has to be seen, it has to be comprehensible within the visual lineages that they are working in and contesting. So they're very, Ligon is like making paintings, right? Simpson is making, photography with a capital P, photography, very much engaged in that phototextual tradition. So it looks similar to those works, but is opening up a new kind of change on the politics of representation by bringing race into the picture. And I think what their work helps us to understand is that race is always in the picture if you look for it, right? And I think we have sort of trained ourselves not to sort of be able to look at and confront those kind of questions, even when they're central to the works in front of us, right? So, I mean, my great example is Manet's Olympia, right? For 100 years, nobody ever talked about the Black maid in that picture, right? But she takes up like a third of the canvas, right? So it sort of underlines the way in which art history has often overlooked the very visual evidence in front of it in order to avoid trying to take on the complexities of race and racialization, which everywhere saturate the visual field in the modern era.
Thank you so much. And is any one of you from the audience who would like to add something? You can raise your hand if you're not feeling too shy to speak up. But anyway, Giorgio, would you like to ask you something to Professor Copeland?
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear you speaking, and this talk really with so many hints and suggestions. And I was thinking also of about your last article, maybe dialogue between you and Alison Glynn, published in Art Forum, in the last issues of Art Forum, which is around some of the topics you spoke this evening with us. And in particular, I was wondering how these new concepts that you are dealing with in this period are determining, if they are determining, the reframing also of the museums, both from a didactic point of view and from an exhibition point of view, I mean.
No, that I think is a really fantastic question. And I think, last summer was a massive moment of racial reckoning across the United States that was felt across the world. And museums were no exception, trying to understand, the ways in which their practices not only centralized a certain kind of racist narrative and presentation, but also what that meant for their ability to reach out and engage diverse audiences, which is increasingly important for US institutions since it's going to be a majority country by 2050. So I think, a lot of museums have been trying to think about how do we deal with the histories of racialized violence that are, embedded in our collecting and our practices, and how do we change them, and how do we mindfully reach out and to begin engaging with communities in new ways, so that they understand the museum not simply as a temple to which one goes to learn how to be a subject of culture, but real sites of engagement that represent and speak to the concerns of folks in the community. And this exhibition that Giorgio is referencing, that Alison Glynn curated, I think, is really a model of this sort. So Alison Glynn is now the chief curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston. And she put together this show for the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, in honor of Breonna Taylor, whom many of you might know was a Black woman who was murdered in her sleep by the police last year, leading to protests not only in Louisville, but also, adding to the anger and the righteous fury that accompanied the protests of George Floyd's murder. So the museum knew it wanted to do this exhibition, and I think there was an institutional will there, but it also knew how it did the show would be as important as what the show was. So what Glenn did was to assemble a kind of curatorial team, a listening group composed of artists, art historians, other folks who have been victims of similar violence, and most importantly, Ms. Palmer, Breonna Taylor's mother, so that they would really be active participants in the creation of the show. And as it's installed in the Speed Museum, which has a wonderful kind of collection of European art, the show takes over the space in the museum traditionally devoted to Dutch and Flemish masters in a kind of decolonial gesture. And it provides not only a kind of range of artworks that speak to the different thematic sections of the show, promise, witness, remembrance, but it also really centers Breonna Taylor's life, the timeline of her life that's written by her mother, and then this fantastic portrait by Amy Sherald, who also produced the portrait of Michelle Obama, that really is at the center of the exhibition. You can see it from all these sort of different vantage points. So to me, that exhibition really was a model of how museums might work thoughtfully, mindfully, and collaboratively with their communities to make shows that speak to the exigencies of the moment, and not only advance further conversation about the relationship between art and activism, but also make the museum a new site for those conversations in terms of the audiences that it can bring in. And I think, this again is, a fantastic effort, but it's a temporary exhibition and a temporary moment. And I think as that Lipton quote is meant to emphasize, those moments are often fleeting, and who knows how long they might last. In 5 years, we might think, oh, we reckoned with racism and we'll be back to business as usual. So I think, though, there's a certain optimism about this moment and the reckoning it's occasioned, I think one has to also be realistic in terms of seeing how in a long historical period, these moments of opening and experimentation are often forgotten or foreclosed, right? So if we think about, in the context of the 1990s, we had multiculturalism in the early 1990s, everyone would have a narrative. And then suddenly 1995 happened, we want global and it's got to be beautiful, right? David Hickey comes to sort of the fore, right? So there are always these kinds of shifts, I think, in terms of the awareness of the relationship between vision, race, and justice. And hopefully now we're at a place where we can not only see those relationships, but actually start to think, what do our understanding of the power dynamics there mean for how we want to rethink what a museum does, who it speaks to, and who it engages? And I think, a wonderful model that I've been able to closely follow this year has been the sort of transformation that's happened at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., with its rebranding and its new logo of the nation for all the people. Right. And so trying to think about what does it mean to take this, relatively old, august institution founded primarily in terms of European and American collections and pivot it, right? So it can become more representative of American history and American demographics.
Thank you so much. We were extending our discussion into exhibitions and museums and so on. So thank you so much. So thanks again for being with us in this virtual meeting. So for all the people who joined us, the recording of all our lecture will be available on our website in the upcoming weeks. And I'm switching into Italian again. Grazie Giorgio Bacci, grazie Sagas, tutto il Dipartimento dell'Università di Firenze che ha contribuito all'organizzazione di questi 4 incontri che sono stati un'occasione preziosa per entrare dentro ulteriormente a delle letture della mostra attualmente in corso, e quindi rimarrà poi testimonianza sul nostro sito di tutto questo lavoro svolto insieme. Quindi grazie Giorgio Bacci che è qui con noi, ringrazio anche la professoressa Tiziana Serena che ha partecipato agli altri appuntamenti, tutti gli altri ospiti nelle precedenti settimane, e ci rivedremo, spero in presenza, a partire dalle prossime mostre che inaugureranno poi da ottobre, e riprenderemo con la nostra programmazione. Quindi grazie a tutti, grazie ancora a Huey Copeland qui con noi, Sagas, Università di Firenze. Buona serata a tutti.
Grazie, buonasera a tutti.